The construction of Harrenhal is one of those things in Westeros that as soon as you hear about it, you want to know more. And I think there is something deeper going on here. An actual goal that Harren the Black had in mind when he was doing the things that he was doing to build his castle. This guy supposedly chops down weirwoods that are thousands of years old to use as the beams in his walls, and then he mortars the stone with blood. Then, after constructing the largest castle in all of Westeros, on the day that he laid his final stone, a dragon lord invades the continent. So then Aegon the Conqueror shows up at Harrenhal, and for some reason, Harren the Black is very confident that his castle can withstand whatever Aegon throws at it. In a move that would end up with Harren the Black painted as an arrogant idiot in the history books forever, he told Aegon the Conqueror as much. He basically said that there's nothing you're going to be able to do, I'll be safe inside my walls, and Aegon said we'll see about that. So, with Harren and all of his family hidden away in the towers of Harrenhal and the castle fully manned and defended, it's said that Aegon the Conqueror flew on his dragon so high up in the air that he was lost up in the clouds, you could barely see him at all, and then when he was nothing but a little dot up in the sky, he flew his dragon straight down directly on top of Harrenhal, coming down already within its walls. He proceeded to roast the castle from the inside out, starting with those big towers where Harren and his family were staying. Bankrupting your entire realm to build a giant castle that on the first day you finish it gets your entire family roasted by dragons has widely been considered to be a bad move by history, and many people suggest that Harren the Black was stupid and didn't know what he was doing. But actually, I think we might have enough evidence to point us directly at what Harren the Black was trying to accomplish when he built Harrenhal. And had dragons not showed up for basically the first time in Westeros, he probably would have had exactly what he wanted and gotten the magical result that he was after. So today I'll try to tie together all of those little world building clues that George has laid out for us, and I'll try to explain exactly what Harren the Black was trying to do when he built Harrenhal. Now, the first little puzzle piece that I want to talk about is something that I actually talked about last video on the channel. Basically, the idea of how do you grow a weirwood. If you haven't seen the video, you can go check it out after this, but basically the conclusion that we came to is that one way that would probably work pretty well is taking from an existing weirwood, essentially doing a cutting or a grafting, and then you take that weirwood cutting and you essentially water it with blood or some sort of human sacrifice. The evidence for this being that the weirwood seem to drink blood, and they also seem to take in like sacrificial magic as some sort of energy, so whatever you want to call it, making a sacrifice to start growing a new weirwood is something that you might want to do. So, if it is indeed possible to grow a weirwood from a cutting or a grafting of a weirwood that is watered with blood or sacrifice, well, then the idea of using weirwood beams in your walls and mortaring your stone with blood and human sacrifice is something that you can look at a little bit differently. Suddenly, it starts to sound a lot like a magical recipe, a recipe that would lead to a lot of weirwoods growing inside of your castle walls. And that's interesting because when we see Harrenhal in House of the Dragon Season 2, there are weirwood roots growing out of the walls everywhere. So it seems like if Harren the Black was putting weirwood cuttings inside of his walls and surrounding them with sacrificial blood in an attempt to grow weirwoods in his walls, well, he was sort of successful in the long run. He just wasn't around to see it. So then the next question you would ask is why would someone want weirwoods growing inside of their castle walls? And this is the part where it gets really interesting. To me, it seems that it's being set up that weirwoods could be used as a magical ward, and the place that we see this on display the most clearly is at the entrance to Bloodraven's cave. The Whites and Cold Hands can't pass through the entrance into Bloodraven's cave, and furthermore, Bran is warging inside Hodor's mind when Hodor crosses through the entrance into the cave, and Bran is actually kicked out of Hodor, essentially proving that this forms a magical warded barrier. So it blocks whites from crossing, it blocks cold hands from crossing, and it seems to also interfere with the warging magical connection. These are all things that the entrance to Bloodraven's cave shares in common with the wall. When Cold Hands points out the entrance to this cave in the books, he points it out as in between two weirwoods. So this magically protective barrier is between two weirwoods. And when Cold Hands is stopped at the wall, the place that he has to stop is at the Black Gate, which is of course a giant weirwood face inside the wall. It's also built into a well shaft, which I've talked about in past videos might actually just be a giant hollow weirwood trunk. It has a bit of a branch like weirwood growing out from the top of it, It has a big weirwood face in the side of it. That sounds a bit like a weirwood trunk to me. The point of all of that being that the wall seems to also have weirwoods inside of it, and if there's weirwoods in both of these magical barriers, and the weirwoods are one of the things in the story that's proven to be magical, it seems to make a lot of sense that the weirwoods are the thing that are causing this magical barrier. Also, some very strong evidence for this, of course, is the fact that the children of the forest use weirwoods to do their magic, and places like Winterfell and the Wall were said to be built by Brandon Builder, who had the help of the children of the forest. The children of the forest were said to live in places that were called secret tree towns, and that really does seem to describe what Bloodraven's Cave is. It's in a big hill that is covered in a bunch of trees, some of which are weirwoods, and the whole place is magically warded. Winterfell itself also sits on a big hill and is often described like a great stone tree, and it's said that it has roots that run deep below the earth, and its towers are like tree trunks and all of this stuff. There's a lot of foreshadowing that basically Winterfell is very similar, and potentially there could even be weirwoods inside of the walls of Winterfell as a sort of magical ward in a similar way to these other places. Basically, we don't have like direct evidence or direct confirmation that Winterfell itself is built on top of one of these old secret tree towns and that there are weirwoods somehow built into the foundations or built into the walls and that they're somehow forming a magical ward, but it would make complete sense. Especially when you take into account another location that was said to be worked on by Brandon the Builder. That would be Storm's End. It was said to be built with the help of Brandon the Builder, and it's a location that we see Melisandre have to be smuggled inside of before she can birth her shadow baby, because she confirms that it has magical wards built into the walls. Another thing that Storm's End and Winterfell have in common is that they have incredibly thick walls. Walls perhaps thick enough for weirwoods to be inside of and not be noticed. This is also something that, of course, they have in common with the wall, which is the thickest and the largest wall possible. So you can see how you can sort of start tying the clues found at these different magical locations all together once you sort of notice the Weirwood connection and the Brand and the Builder connection, and how all of these locations are functioning in similar ways. You have the active magical ward at Bloodraven's Cave and the Wall and at Storm's End. We haven't seen it directly at Winterfell, but we can assume that it's probably also there. You have the Brandon the Builder connection at Storm's End, at Winterfell, at the Wall, and when you connect him to the Children of the Forest, you also have it at Bloodraven's Cave. The cave is likely built on top of a tree town. Winterfell could very likely be built on top of an old tree town because it's built on top of a hill. The Night Fort is built on top of a hill at the wall, and there's a giant magical tree inside the wall at the hill there, so the Night Fort itself could also have been built on top of an old Children of the Forest tree town. And Storm's End could also potentially have been built on an old Children of the Forest tree town if you take into account that maybe that's what Brandon the Builder told them to do. It was one of those things where they tried to build the castle a bunch of times and the storm god kept destroying it, and then Brandon the Builder supposedly helped and that one worked out. Maybe what he told them to do was build it on an important magical location and use the weirwood trees inside of the walls. And even if it didn't help with the storm god, if this weirwood tree ward that's on display at Bloodraven's Cave can be used to stop the others, and Brandon the Builder, obviously having built the wall, will know about the others, it would make sense that he would obviously help them build Storm's End with a magical ward inside of the walls that could also repel the others. This is another reason I think it's so likely that there's also a ward active at Winterfell, because if you can build it at Storm's End and you can build it in the wall, why wouldn't you build it at Winterfell if there's a way to stop the others? So I assume Brandon the Builder put one there as well. So basically, these most powerful magical locations in Westeros, said to be built by Brandon the Builder, are essentially there to stop the others, and they're built using Weirwood warded magic, and they're built on important magical tree based locations. So then thousands and thousands of years go by, and how these things were actually built fades away into legend. But then suddenly along comes this guy who is trying to become a king in Westeros, just like those who rule from Winterfell or Storm's End, and for his new kingdom, he needs to build a new castle. And what do you know? All of those connections that we just established are on display at Harrenhal as well. Harrenhal has those big thick walls, just like all of those other locations, big enough to potentially hide some magical trees inside of, and as we talked about at the beginning, he very clearly does have weirwoods inside of his walls, and may have even put them inside of his walls in a way that is very close to what you would do if you wanted those weirwoods to grow. Harrenhal is also, of course, built directly next to the Isle of Faces, which is about as important as it gets for a magical old god's location. So it's just following the model that is set by Brandon the Builder. Harren the Black is trying to build a giant magical warded castle with thick walls and living weirwoods inside of it because he knows what Brandon the Builder did, and he wants to do the same thing so that his family can have the same sort of protection that the Starks did and that the Durandons did when they were ruling from Storm's End. And when you think about it, it kind of makes complete sense that Harren the Black would be someone who would have this secret lost knowledge. What's one of the ways in Westeros that knowledge can be lost? You write it down in a book somewhere, and then that book gets stolen by the Ironborn. The Ironborn are the ones who go around raiding treasures from the mainland, and then basically just putting it all in castles on their islands and never looking at it, especially if it's something like a book. The potential for there to be some lost knowledge from the mainland that's held by the Ironborn today is something that makes a character like Roderick the Reader so interesting, and it's something that would potentially explain how Harren the Black was figuring out all of these ancient First Men secrets, and how he knew what to do when he was building his giant magically protected castle. Maybe today no one remembers how Brandon the Builder did all of this or how any of these things were built, but maybe 3,000 years ago they did know about it, and someone wrote it down in a book that was taken and has been sitting in the basement of a castle on the Iron Islands ever since. And then Harren the Black, if he wasn't a complete idiot, which kind of makes sense that he wouldn't be because he was the most successful, basically, of all the Ironborn. So if you assume that he was at least a bit smarter than normal, he would potentially have found this book and been able to take this knowledge and actually try to replicate it when it came time for him to build his magical castle to support his family for future generations. In fact, the idea that Harren the Black at some point while he was conquering places was going around collecting magical knowledge is something that also would make complete sense, if you assume that he's a smart character, and you're in a world where magic exists, a smart character is going to go around collecting magical knowledge. So one way or another, I think Harren the Black got a hold of the knowledge of what Brandon the Builder was actually doing back in the day when he was building these magical structures, and that's what he was trying to do when he built Harrenhal. And if you agree with the logic that Harren the Black would be one of the people most likely to have access to lost or ancient magical knowledge, it really does make sense that he might have even known about the others, and was building his castle to prepare for them. He built a giant magical warded structure following all of the ancient magical instructions that he could find, and he thought he had a very solid working magical ward inside of his walls. That's why he was really cocky when Aegon the Conqueror showed up, and why he told him that nothing he could do could hurt him, because he had a working magical ward that was built to stop the others, and had been built to stop every sort of magic that we've seen in Westeros until the arrival of dragons. Unfortunately for Harren the Black, Aegon was able to fly on his dragon so high up in the air that he couldn't be seen, and I think high enough to get over the magical ward of Harren the Black's walls. I think this is why George R. R. Martin describes Aegon as flying so high that he couldn't be seen, and then all of a sudden he comes down already inside of the walls, because he needed to get over the magical ward which was active, and which was working. Harren the Black knew what he was doing when he built Harrenhal. His magical ward was working. He just got outmaneuvered by someone who changed the rules and changed the magic on the table in Westeros. But I think it really paints Harren in a very different light when you realize he may have had a reason that he was so confident when he told Aegon the Conqueror that his walls would protect him. It also potentially gives us an interesting look into the type of dark blood magic that actually went into building a place like Winterfell or Storm's End. The old gods and the weirwoods, they drink blood, and I think that 8,000 years ago, whenever Winterfell was built, it was probably pretty similar. But no one around is actually able to remember anyone who was sacrificed in the building of Winterfell or Storm's End, or whose blood was worked into the mortar of the walls. You can almost imagine an alternate timeline where dragons never showed up and Harren the Black's line ruled for 8,000 years, and now everyone just talked about how great they were because everybody had to worship them because they were in charge. And no one would remember how bloody and crazy the building of Harrenhal was. All they would know is that it's the greatest castle in all of the land and it has all of these magical protections around it, so you better not bother to attack. That's how we feel about Winterfell and Storm's End in our modern story, and I think if things had gone a little bit differently in the timeline, maybe 8,000 years from now, that's how they would have felt about Harrenhal. But let me know what you think of all of this stuff down there in the comments, and make sure to like and subscribe while you're down there. Lots of really interesting topics today, so I'm sure there will be a lot of really interesting discussion down there in the comments. Just to give my take on a few questions I can already see people asking down there. Okay, well, why would the ward at Harrenhal have a height limit if the wall doesn't seem to have one? Or could a dragon potentially fly high enough to get over the wall? I would think that potentially there are a few explanations for this. Maybe the height limit is like some sort of multiple of the height of the wall that's actually warded. So then that like the wall's height limit is so high that the dragon would have to be in space and couldn't actually like fly over the wall. So maybe that's how the wall's height limit is basically infinite because it's so high that it just doesn't practically matter. And then Harrenhal's height limit isn't quite that high because its walls aren't quite as tall as the actual wall itself. Or potentially just straight up, the wall itself has a greater magical power behind it than whatever Harren the Black was able to work into his walls. Or maybe because the weirwoods inside of Harren's walls were just recently watered with blood for the first time and were just starting to grow, maybe the ward wasn't quite as high as the ancient ward of the wall, because it's been sitting in place for thousands of years. I don't know, there are many explanations that you could go through, is my point, in terms of explaining why Aegon the Conqueror would be able to eventually get high enough in the air to get over Black Harren's ward, but I really do think that's a reasonable explanation for why he did that maneuver on his dragon. The other thing that I could see people saying is, okay, well, if the ward of Harrenhal would have stopped the dragons, how come we can see some dragons flying in and out of Storm's End? Well, we've never seen Storm's End or Winterfell ever be besieged by dragons, and I think the magical wards allow the creatures to pass when they're invited in by whoever's in charge of the magical location. I think it's definitely worth noting that Harren the Black is the only character who we know who owns one of these magically constructed castles built in this style, who ever openly opposes a dragon lord, and this is the result. In terms of the whole idea of the ward caring about what the person in charge of the structure wants to allow in or keep out, this is set up pretty well in the text by what happens with the whites that attack Jeor Mormont. They appear to have been whited and left by the wall, and they're playing dead, and Jeor Mormont, the one who's in charge of the wall, so therefore in charge of the magical location, tells them to bring them across the wall. So he essentially invites these whites in, and that's why they're the only whites that are able to pass across the border of the wall, because they were invited in. They were invited by the Lord Commander and then physically carried across by brothers of the Night's Watch. This is probably the thing that allowed them to get across the magically protected barrier that is manned by the Night's Watch. So, if the person, whoever's in charge of Storm's End or Winterfell, is okay with the dragon coming in, then it would make sense that the dragon would be able to pass over the walls, at least to me. I have a whole video talking about that where the whites are able to pass the wall because of Jeor Mormont, and so I'll have that as an end card video here if you want to check out like the full explanation on that. Thank you guys all very much for watching, and I'll be back with something else very soon.